Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act bars employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex. But does Title VII also protect against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity?
Gerald Bostock is a welfare caseworker from Georgia. He said he was fired because he's gay.
We're talking about millions and millions of people that go to work every day fearful for being fired for who they are, how they identify, and who they love.
A major civil rights decision out of the United States Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court has ruled that federal law prohibits discrimination in the workplace on the basis of sexual orientation.
It doesn't matter whether you work in Illinois or Missouri. It doesn't matter whether or not you are in Ohio or Indiana. You will now have the full protection of federal law.
Dominique Remy Fels, Nina Pop, Marilyn Casares, Tony McDade, just a few of the names of the 37 transgender and gender non-conforming people violently killed in 2020.
Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human rights!
A lot of transgender, especially black females, are being murdered, but it's not like it just happened. It's been an ongoing thing for years.
What was your reaction to hear not one, but two trans women of color gunned down in a matter of months on the same street?
I was shocked. My reaction, honestly, was am I next?
Well, hello there.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So I wanted to just start off by you introducing yourself. What do you do at Power? What's kind of like your Power story?
Yeah, so I started at Power in April 2019 as a scheduling agent. Shout out to my scheduling squad. I moved to the marketing communications team in March 2020. And essentially, I'm lucky enough to work with the creative team behind everything we see at Power, from in-home sales assets to CD leave-behinds to even the branding for summits like this, which is pretty cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, speaking to you beforehand, you know, you've had the ability to like live in your truth when it comes to your job, you know, previously before this, and even here at Power. I kind of want to like hear your kind of your story and how that's been for you.
Yeah, so when I came to Power as an out gay man, I expected, you know, all of the things that members of the queer community run into. I expected, you know, coworkers who would not be accepting. I expected the looks and the whispers. What I got at Power is completely different. Not only am I accepted here at Power, but I'm celebrated for who I am, which is awesome. I do think that being out at work is something that we can sometimes take for granted. It feels so good to live our lives without the fear of scrutiny that comes with being in the closet. And I know that not everybody has the same experience. I mean, I know that your story is a bit different as well.
Yeah, it was a little bit different. So actually the reason why I took the job at Power is because I wasn't able to be out at my previous workplace. And like when you spend your life closeted, once you leave that closet, it's hard to go back in. And with every new job, it feels like you're constantly restarting. So I started off in a different territory other than the one that I'm currently in. And my experience there wasn't great. It was a lot of that like culture of, you know, homophobic comments and words. And I promised myself that, you know, even though I loved Power, I wasn't going to go through that again. So I used Dallas as an opportunity to kind of restart and to see if I could be out within my workplace. And it's kind of funny because we had an event the very first day that we were down there. And someone had came up to me and said, you know, are you gay? And it felt good. I'm like, yes, I am actually. Thanks for asking. And then he subsequently told everybody there, and not in a malicious way, more of like a, you know, I want this to be on your radar. And I had several individuals come up to me and say, yo, that wasn't his place to tell us. That was your story to tell. You know, you should have told us when you were ready. Like he shouldn't have forced that, and we're here for you, and we have your back. And it was at that moment that I realized that I can have the best of both worlds. I can live in my truth every day in the place that I work at, and not have to be forced back into that closet. And it just felt good. And I realized then that this is where I wanted to be. And, you know, Power has changed a lot. I started 6 years ago, right? So hearing that, your story, and knowing that that wasn't the case back then and what has transpired since then for us to get there, I think it's pretty incredible.
Absolutely.
So I kind of want to shift gears just a little bit. So on June 15th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to discriminate against the queer community in hiring and firing practices. Now, the previous laws legally allowed an employer to terminate someone based off of their sexual identity. Now, how does it feel to have the Supreme Court rule in our favor, particularly when we're talking about a mostly Republican Supreme Court?
Yeah, so while I'm excited that I can no longer be fired just for being gay, I also believe that these cases should have never had to have been argued in front of the Supreme Court. I think in the June 2020 cases, Justices Gorsuch and Roberts, the two conservatives who flipped for the decision, really did the bare minimum here. We're talking about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, for decades should have protected all Americans against discrimination in hiring and firing based off of age, race, religion, gender, and, other identities. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of room for discrimination. I mean, even today, there are 27 states with no laws protecting queer people against discrimination in housing. There are 20 states with no laws protecting the queer community against discrimination in adoption. Some of these states even include power territories, states like Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, and that's just to name a few. Michigan, Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, and 7 others legally allow welfare and adoption agencies to refuse to provide services to queer children or adults if the agency determines that it goes against their religious freedoms. Even earlier this week, it was announced that the Senate would vote on the Equality Act, which is the first federal law, that protects against discrimination against the queer community. And for context, the Equality Act has been introduced in the House every year since 2015. It was finally passed in May 2019, and this is the first time that the Senate is actually going to vote on it. It's so tiring to consistently have to fight for the same rights as non-queer people. And while these landmark events are a step in the right direction, there's still a lot of fighting to be done.
100%. I could not agree more. And actually, when you think about the queer community, when we talk about the LGBTQIA plus rights in the community, I think the T is often silent. And when we talk about last year, we saw a historic year for trans people in a negative way. It was especially amongst trans people of color. So there are more anti-trans legislation waiting to be voted on than ever before. This legislation includes prevention of medication, using self-identified restrooms, and the inability for trans youth to be addressed by their pronouns in a school setting, to name a few. There were more deaths amongst the trans community than any year prior, again, especially amongst minorities. We saw celebrities like J.K. Rowling publicly making disparaging comments against the trans community. During the previous administration, trans people were banned from serving in the Army, something that the administration prior to that had legalized. Why do you think the trans community is still facing discrimination at such a wide disparity?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes from the stigma around the trans community, just created by fear of the unknown and a lack of understanding in the experiences of that community, right? So when you're cisgendered, meaning your gender identity is the same as what you were assigned at birth, it can be logically challenging just to put yourself in the shoes of, someone who has not had the same experience. That said, there are really only 2 ways to handle, a lack of understanding. There's education and growth, or bigotry and transphobia. And to be clear, transphobia is never the correct answer. Now, adding fuel to this fire is the rhetoric from celebrities and public officials, right? You mentioned J.K. Rowling, for example. But anyone who takes to social media and mass media to speak negatively on trans issues is doing so from a place of bigotry. And the worst part is, in the U.S., they can do this, right? So transphobic and homophobic rhetoric is considered hate speech in the U.S. And for those who don't know, in 2017, the Supreme Court voted unanimously to reaffirm that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. Our systems are literally failing the trans community and other communities. According to a Human Rights Campaign, in the U.S., 3 out of 10 adults personally know somebody who is trans. The community faces challenges in every facet of their lives. 29% of trans adults live in poverty. That number jumps to 39% and 48% for the Black and Latinx communities of trans adults as well. Like you mentioned, violence in the community in 2020 was the highest it's been on record, and it disproportionately impacts trans women of color. They make up 4 out of 5 anti-transgender homicides. This is a public health crisis that, while becoming more visible, is not being paid attention to enough. Trans rights are quickly becoming the struggle of our generation.
It really is. It's like funny that you say that, because I've always felt like, when we think about our grandparents, right? It's really, their movement was the civil rights movement. It was allowing black people to have same rights as white people. And then our parents, kind of went through their movement, which was for gay people. And I think the onus is on our generation to be that voice for the trans community. Absolutely. I think like we have to start pivoting and making, giving trans people the same playing field that we all do. So I completely agree with that. And I think it starts within our own walls. For a company that's as progressive as Power, we've been able to provide homes for so many underrepresented groups that are often mistreated. Look at the VET initiative, for instance. Look at the queer community. Yeah. We're continuing to grow, but we've struggled with with the retention of trans employees and having them feel that same sense of family and that same sense of protection that we've achieved for so many other people. What do you think we could be doing to provide that safe, inclusive atmosphere for the trans community?
Yeah, I think that this is something that we, myself included, need to do a better job of letting people know. We need to let them know that it's a safe space here. We do a lot of this like broad messaging around it in, kickoffs or town halls or things like that. But the real impact comes on at the personal level. Genuinely getting to know somebody can make them feel supported and offers, opportunities for that person to communicate situations in which they would feel unsafe. Having allies can mean the world to somebody. A lot of the times growing up, members of the queer community face bullying and isolation, and it can make you feel like there won't ever be somebody on your side. For all of us, work is a huge part of our lives. It's what we do all day long during the week, right? And sometimes even on the weekends, especially here at Power. So when we have allies like we do in the workplace at Power, it can help break that cycle of isolation. Having allies at work translates into every part of our lives, from mental health to our friends, our relationships, and to the everyday activities that we engage in. Active allyship is so important for trans individuals to stay at Power, but to thrive at Power.
Right. Could not agree more. Well, thank you so much. This conversation has been incredible. I think there's a lot of things that we kind of went over, but if you had one takeaway, one thing that you would want the audience to remember and take away from this, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, I think civil rights activist and poet Audre Lorde put it best. It's not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And I think we've always been able to recognize our differences. Mm-hmm. Some of us accept them, and I have to believe that one day as a society, we will celebrate them. So I'll just leave you with this, right? Lead with empathy, choose kindness, engage with compassion, but most importantly, celebrate what makes you, you.
I love that. Celebrate what makes you, you. Well, thank you again. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah.
When we talk about 2020, I think one word that's synonymous with that year is COVID. But after the death of George Floyd, one topic also took lead, and that was Black Lives Matter. But in order to better explain that and talk about that, we're going to pass it on to Allie and Chris.